The first note of the opening hymn had already sounded when the doors came open. It was a Sunday in September, and the light inside Greater Zion Baptist Church on Caldwell Street was the particular light of a building that had been doing the same thing in the same place for 67 years, warm and diffused and carrying the weight of all the mornings that had preceded it. All the voices and all the silence and all the particular stillness of people who have come together for a purpose that does not require explanation. Reverend Elijah Morehouse stood at the pulpit. He was 61 years old, and he had been the pastor of Greater Zion for 19 years, and he had stood at this pulpit every Sunday for all of those years, with the exception of 3 Sundays when illness had required him to yield it to his associate pastor, and even on those 3 Sundays, he had been present in the front pew, which was a form of presence that the congregation understood and respected. The pulpit itself was 43 years old. It had been built by a member of the congregation named Clarence Dupree, who had been a carpenter and a deacon, and who had built the pulpit in 1981 as a gift to the church when the old one had been damaged by a pipe that burst in the winter of that year. Clarence had died in 2004, and his widow Cora still attended services every Sunday in the 6th pew on the right, and when she was asked about the pulpit, she said the same thing she had always said, which was that Clarence built it to last, and that she expected it would outlast her by a considerable margin. She was 83, and she was right about most things. Reverend Morehouse had laid his hands on that pulpit for 19 years. He had stood at it in grief and in celebration in the early Sundays, when he was still learning what it meant to be the head of this particular community, and in the later Sundays, when he had learned enough to know that what he was learning would never be complete. He had stood at it in a snowstorm when 12 people came, because 12 people could not stay away, and he had stood at it on the Sunday after a long-time member died unexpectedly, and the room had been so thick with grief that the hymns were almost inaudible. Every Sunday was different. Every Sunday was the same. That was the thing about the work, the constancy beneath the variation, the specific comfort of a practice that holds its shape, regardless of what arrives to disturb it. He was a tall man, 6'2", lean, but not slight, with the kind of frame that age had made more specific rather than less. His skin was the color of rich earth. His hair gone entirely silver at 61, his face carrying the particular dignity of a man who had chosen his life deliberately and lived it accordingly. He wore his clerical collar and a dark jacket, and he stood at the pulpit with his hands resting on its surface. And when he preached, which was what he was doing, now his voice filled the room from the front to the back, without apparent effort, in the way of a voice that has been shaped over decades by the work of being heard. He had grown up in this building. His father had been a deacon here for 31 years, a man named Samuel Morehouse, who had worked the post office for 28 years, and spent the other hours of his life in service to this congregation with the same practical dedication he brought to sorting mail methodically, without drama attending to each thing in its proper sequence. Samuel had died at 74, and his funeral had been held in this building, and Elijah had stood at this same pulpit and delivered the eulogy without his voice breaking, which was the hardest thing he had done in his first 2 years as head pastor and possibly the hardest thing he had done in his life. His mother, Miriam, had sung in the choir for 23 years. She had a voice that the congregation still mentioned in the specific way that communities mention voices that have been absent long enough to become part of the building's memory. She had retired from the choir at 78, not because her voice had failed, but because her hearing had, and she had decided, in the pragmatic way she decided everything, that a choir member who could not reliably hear the other choir members was a liability rather than an asset. And she had stepped down with complete grace and taken a seat in the front pew from which she had listened to every service since. She was 81 now. She was in that front pew this morning next to Sister Loretta Washington, as she was every Sunday, wearing her yellow hat and her expression of a woman who has been coming to this building for 67 years and has earned the right to occupy it exactly as she wishes. He had been baptized here at 7, had returned here after college and seminary, had been installed as associate pastor at 38 and head pastor at 42, and had stood at this pulpit every week since, with the specific sense of a man who is exactly where he is supposed to be, doing exactly the work he was built to do. The work had not been without difficulty. He had inherited at 42 a congregation that was financially strained, and a building that needed more repair than the budget could immediately absorb. He had spent his first 3 years in a sustained effort to rebuild both, not through any single dramatic decision, but through the accumulation of small, correct decisions made consistently, which was how he had been taught by his father, and how he had found to be universally true. You do the work. You document the work. You build the record. Over time, the record speaks for you. He had grown the food pantry from serving 40 families to serving 312. He had established the after-school program in his 4th year with $2,000 from the congregation's emergency fund and a volunteer roster of 11 members. He had started the scholarship fund in his 7th year with a donation from a former member who had moved to Charlotte and wanted to give something back to the place that had given him his formation. He was proud of none of it in the way of a man taking credit. He was proud of it the way a gardener is proud of a garden, because the things in it grew, and the growing was the point. And his job was to keep the conditions right for growing, not to claim the growth as his own. Greater Zion had 214 active members. It had a food pantry that served 312 families per month. It had an after-school program on Tuesdays and Thursdays that served 41 children. It had a seniors ministry that provided transportation and home visits to 17 elderly members who could no longer reliably drive or walk. It had a scholarship fund that had sent 23 young people to college in 11 years. The building itself was on a corner in a neighborhood that had seen decades of change. Some of the change beneficial, some of it not. And the building had watched it all from the same corner, the same stone facade, the same steeple that needed repainting every 8 years, and was repainted every 8 years because Reverend Morehouse tracked these things and organized the volunteer labor and did not let the building show neglect. He maintained the building the way he maintained everything in his care, with attention and with purpose and without waiting for someone else to handle it. The congregation was 208 this morning. 6 members absent, which he knew the way he knew most things about the people in his care without having to consult a list. Sister Adkins was ill. Her daughter had called the day before. Brother Williams was at a family obligation in Atlanta. The remaining 4 had given no word, which meant he would follow up tomorrow the way he followed up on all such absences, because the follow-up was part of the work. He was midway through the second passage of the sermon, a passage from the book of Isaiah that he had been building toward for 3 weeks, a passage about the restoration of what has been taken and the specific nature of the promise that what is built correctly does not fall when Officer Todd Hargrove entered through the back door. The door opened with the particular sound of a heavy door in a quiet room, not loud but distinct. The kind of sound that registers even in a congregation that is focused on something else. Several people in the back rows turned. Most did not. The sermon was at a point that required attention. Reverend Morehouse at the pulpit did not turn. He had learned years ago that turning toward a disruption was the disruption's goal. It wanted you to stop, and turning confirmed that it had accomplished its purpose. He had learned to absorb peripheral information without diverting from the central task. He had learned this from his mother, who had sung in the choir for 23 years and had absorbed countless disruptions from the pews without losing a note. He kept preaching. He finished the sentence he was in. He began the next. He heard the footsteps on the center aisle. Hargrove was 31. He had been on the force for 7 years. He was a broad-shouldered man with the particular alertness of someone who has been trained to enter spaces and assess them and has mistaken the training for intelligence. He had 2 prior complaints on his record, both arising from interactions with members of the public that his supervisors had characterized in the language of the department's review process as exhibiting poor judgment in de-escalation. Both had been resolved without formal discipline. He had taken the resolutions as confirmations that his judgment had been correct. He had not taken them as warnings. He had received the dispatch at 10:18 that morning. The complaint had been routed to him as a noise violation at a church. He had driven to the address with the particular attitude of a man approaching a straightforward call, something to be handled quickly and efficiently, a box to check a complaint to resolve. He had not consulted his supervisor. The dispatch had not required it. What he had not known, because he had not checked, and because the dispatch system had not flagged it, was that the noise complaint was the fourth such complaint filed against this specific address by the same individual in 4 years, and that the 3 prior complaints had all been investigated and closed without finding. The man who had filed the complaints was named Gerald Wick. He was 54 and he owned a property 6 blocks from Greater Zion, a rental property he had purchased 12 years ago as an investment, a property whose value had been declining steadily as the neighborhood shifted around it. He had been in a dispute with the church since 6 years ago when the then current pastor had authorized a small expansion of the church's north parking area, paving an additional 22 feet of gravel that had formerly served as a visual boundary between the 2 properties. Wick's position was that the expansion had encroached on what he believed, based on his reading of the original survey, to be a shared easement. The church's position, based on a survey it had commissioned at the time, was that the paved area was entirely within the church's recorded property boundary. The surveys disagreed. The dispute had sat unresolved for 6 years because neither party had chosen to take it to court, which would have cost more than either was willing to spend on a 22-foot strip of pavement, and because the original survey was ambiguous in a way that made the outcome of litigation genuinely uncertain. Wick had filed the first noise complaint 2 years after the parking dispute began. The complaint alleged that the church's Sunday services were creating excessive noise that disturbed his tenants. The investigating officer found no violation. The church's sound levels were within code, and the officer noted that the building was 6 blocks from Wick's property, a distance that made the noise complaint factually implausible. The second and third complaints followed in subsequent years, each alleging variations of the same noise violation, each investigated and closed without finding. No one in the department had pulled all 3 complaints together and looked at what they formed when placed beside each other. The pattern was in the system. It had been there for years. No one had read it. The 4th complaint had been filed at 6:47 in the morning on a Sunday when no one was at the church yet, alleging noise violations beginning at 8 a.m. Hargrove had received it 2 hours later and had driven to the address without checking any of it. He walked down the center aisle with the specific confidence of someone who does not understand what he is walking into, which is to say, he walked with no particular regard for the fact that he was entering a room that was occupied and purposeful, and had been occupied and purposeful for 67 years before he arrived. He said, "Excuse me." The word landed in the middle of a sentence. The congregation, 208 people who had come together for a specific purpose and who had been 3/4 of the way through a sermon they had traveled to hear, turned collectively toward the back of the room. Reverend Morehouse paused. He looked at Hargrove with the particular attention of a man who has spent 19 years managing disruptions of all kinds in a building that serves 214 people with varying needs and has learned to assess a situation completely before responding to it. He said, "Can I help you?" His voice was perfectly calibrated, not warm, not cold, present, and authoritative, and carrying the clear implication that whatever was happening in his building and would be addressed on terms that he established. In the congregation, Sister Washington in the front pew had gone very still. She had been a member of Greater Zion for 41 years, and she had watched 3 pastors stand at this pulpit. The first pastor she remembered as a young woman, then Brother Davis, who had served for 11 years, then Elijah Morehouse, who had been at that pulpit for 19 years, and whose father had stood beside her in this building when she was still new to it. She knew Reverend Morehouse's voice. She knew the calibration he was using now. She knew what it meant when it went to that particular register. She watched, Behind her in the second pew, Deacon Marcus Cole had his hands folded in his lap. He was watching the center aisle. He had been a deacon for 7 years and had handled in those 7 years a number of situations that required the specific skill of managing a disruption in a setting that is not designed for disruption. He knew what this looked like. He had been in this building on a Sunday in 2009 when someone had come in during services in a state of acute crisis, and the deacons had managed it quietly and carefully, and the service had continued. He knew how to read the moment. He was reading this moment. Hargrove said, "I need you to come with me." The congregation did not move. 208 people in their pews, in their Sunday clothes, in the specific stillness of people who have heard something that requires them to process it before they respond to it. Reverend Morehouse said, "On what matter?" Hargrove said, "There's been a complaint about noise. I need you to step outside." Reverend Morehouse said, "This congregation is gathered for Sunday worship. We have been gathering for Sunday worship in this building for 67 years. Our services are well within the legal parameters for assembly and sound levels in this district, as documented with the city's permit office, a permit that has been renewed without citation every year for 67 years. He said it the way he said everything, clearly, completely in the tone of a man presenting documented facts to someone who has arrived with insufficient information. Hargrove said, "Sir, I need you to come with me now." Sister Loretta Washington in the front pew, 68 years old, who had been a member of Greater Zion for 41 of those 67 years, closed her eyes briefly and opened them again. Reverend Morehouse said, "I am not going to step outside during Sunday services. If there is a matter that requires addressing, you are welcome to speak with me in the vestibule to the left of the entrance. I will join you there at the conclusion of services, which will conclude in approximately 45 minutes. Hargrove said, "I need you to come now." He reached out and took Reverend Morehouse's arm. The room produced a sound. It was not loud. It was low, a collective intake of breath from 208 people that carried within it every particular thing that each of those 208 people knew about this building and this man and this moment and what it meant. Reverend Morehouse looked at Hargrove's hand on his arm. He said, "Please remove your hand." His voice had not changed in volume. It had not changed in tone. It had changed in something more fundamental in the specific weight behind it. The weight of a man who has spent 61 years building the right to say that sentence in that building. Hargrove said, "You're making this difficult." Reverend Morehouse said, "I am making nothing difficult. I am standing at my pulpit in my church on a Sunday morning. You entered without invitation and disrupted a lawful religious assembly and placed your hand on my arm without cause. I am asking you to remove your hand and to wait in the vestibule if you have legitimate business here." Hargrove tightened his grip. He said, "You're coming with me." He began to move. Reverend Morehouse felt the grip tighten on his arm. He felt the intention in it, the specific intention of a man who has decided to move someone and is committing to that decision. He felt the fabric of his jacket sleeve tighten against his forearm. He felt the pressure through the cloth. 5 fingers, not loose, not tentative. The grip of someone who expected compliance and was adjusting his hold to produce it. He felt his own body's response to that grip, the instinctive tension that rose in him, the thing that lives beneath language, and beneath composure, and beneath 61 years of choosing deliberately, the thing that is simply a person being touched without consent, and knowing it is not right. He registered it. He named it to himself, which was something he had learned to do over many years, to name what was happening inside him with precision, because precision prevented him from being controlled by it. He thought, "I am standing in my church. This is my pulpit. These are my people. This man does not have the authority to move me, and I will not give him permission to move me by behaving as though he does." He thought about his father. He thought about the specific thing his father had said to him when he was 12 years old, and a teacher had spoken to him in a way that was not right, and he had wanted to respond in kind. His father had said, "The most powerful thing you can do in that moment is to remain completely yourself. Because if you become what they want you to become, if you get loud, if you lose your composure, you have given them something. And what you have given them is the ability to make this about your behavior instead of theirs. You keep yourself. You remain who you are. You document what happens, and then you address it through the correct channels with the full weight of what you know. He had been 12. He had not fully understood it. He understood it now. He stood at the pulpit with a man's hand on his arm in front of 208 people who were watching, and he remained completely himself. What happened next happened without coordination and without direction, and without any word being said by anyone that could be described as an instruction. Sister Loretta Washington stood up. She was 68 years old and she had arthritis in both knees, and she stood up from the front pew with the particular deliberateness of a woman who has made a decision that is going to require everything she has. She did not look at anyone. She did not gesture to anyone. She simply rose to her full height, which was 5 feet 4, and stood, and the act of standing was complete in itself. Behind her, Miriam Morehouse, the Reverend's 81-year-old mother in her yellow hat, who had been watching from the front pew since Hargrove walked in with the expression of a woman who has seen a great deal in 81 years and is not surprised by any of it, but is very clearly decided about it, stood up. Behind her, Marcus Cole, 44, deacon, who sat in the second pew on the left, stood up. Behind him, Denise Harrington, 37, who had joined Greater Zion 6 years ago when her husband left, and who had found in it something she had not known she was looking for, and who would describe the moment later to her sister as the first time she understood what she had found, stood up. A man named Howard Briggs, who was 73 and who had not been able to easily stand for 2 years due to a hip replacement that had not healed as expected, stood up. It cost him something visible. He did it without hesitation. The teenager in the 4th row 16 who came with his grandmother every Sunday and who spent most of the service on his phone and who would later tell his grandmother that he had not looked at his phone once during the entire exchange, stood up. One by one, in no prescribed order, with no signal given or received, 208 people stood up. It took 11 seconds. At the end of 11 seconds, every person in Greater Zion Baptist Church was on their feet. They did not move forward. They did not speak. They stood in their pews the way people stand when they have made a decision that does not require movement or speech to communicate, when the standing itself is the communication, complete and unambiguous. Hargrove in the center aisle was surrounded by it. They did not speak. They did not advance. They did not threaten. They stood in their pews, 208 of them in their Sunday clothes, in the specific stillness of people who have decided something and have communicated the decision without words. Hargrove stopped. He looked at the 208 people standing in silence in front of him. He released Reverend Morehouse's arm. The Reverend turned to face his congregation. He looked at them, at all of them, at Sister Loretta Washington in the front pew, at Marcus Cole in the second, at the faces he had known for decades, and the faces he had known for years, and the faces of the newest members who had come, not knowing what they were becoming part of. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said thank you. It was 2 words. It contained everything. He turned back to Hargrove. He said, "I would like your badge number and your supervisor's name. I will be speaking with both the department's community liaison and the city's legal counsel before the close of business tomorrow. I would suggest that in the meantime you consult with your supervisor about the legal parameters governing entry into a house of worship during a lawful religious assembly." He said it with complete composure. He said it the way he said things when he was concluding them. He said you may wait in the vestibule if you have legitimate business. Otherwise, the door you entered through is behind you. He turned back to his congregation. He placed his hands on the pulpit. He said, "Please be seated." 208 people sat down. Hargrove stood in the center aisle for 3 seconds that felt considerably longer than 3 seconds. Then he walked to the vestibule. He did not look at anyone on his way. Reverend Morehouse waited for the room to settle. He said, "We will return to our text." And they did. He finished the sermon. He finished the services. He spoke with Sister Loretta Washington afterward about her knees, which she said were fine. She had stood because it was right to stand, and her knees could manage right. He spoke with the deacon board in the vestibule for 20 minutes after services. He sent Deacon Marcus Cole to speak with Hargrove, who was still in the vestibule, and to take his badge number and supervisor's name. Deacon Cole returned with both. He had also returned with something else, Hargrove's supervisor's phone number, which Hargrove had provided without being asked, in the specific manner of a man who has spent 45 minutes in a vestibule reassessing his morning and has arrived at a different understanding of his situation than the one he had when he walked in. Deacon Cole said he was quiet in there. Reverend Morehouse said how quiet. Deacon Cole said the kind of quiet that has a lot in it. Reverend Morehouse said all right. He took the badge number and the supervisor information. Reverend Morehouse wrote them in the small leather journal he had been keeping for 19 years, in the same handwriting he used for everything deliberate and clear, each letter formed with the intention that it be readable. Then he wrote something else beneath them. He wrote 208. 11 seconds. The sermon was finished. He had written more elaborate entries in the journal over 19 years. He had written full accounts of difficult situations, difficult counseling sessions, difficult moments in the congregation's life. He had written about the financial crisis of his third year and the water damage in the fellowship hall and the passing of 3 members in a single month, one December, that had required him to deliver 3 eulogies in 11 days. But this entry, 208. 11 seconds. The sermon was finished was the one he knew he would read again and again, not because it described the wrong that had been done, because it described what the congregation had done in response to the wrong. And what they had done was the thing that mattered most. They had stood up without being asked, and then they had sat back down and let the service continue. And the service had continued, and the sermon had been finished. That was the whole of it, really. That was 67 years on a corner. Then he went home. His wife Constance had been watching the service on the church's live stream from their kitchen because she had been managing a head cold that she had decided was not sufficiently improved to justify sitting in a room with 208 people for 2 hours. She was 59, a retired circuit court judge, and she had watched the entire exchange from the beginning with the particular attention of a woman whose 31 years on the bench had trained her to observe institutional behavior with complete accuracy. When he came through the door, she said, "Sit down." She said it the way she said most important things, not harshly, but with the complete clarity of a woman who has decided that what comes next requires his full attention. He sat down. She said, "I watched from the greeting. I have been taking notes. I need to tell you what you have." What she told him over the next 40 minutes at the kitchen table with her notes spread before her and a legal pad in front of him was not what he expected. She told him about the noise complaint. She had pulled the city's complaint records while watching the service accessible online, which she had known how to navigate since her first term on the bench. The complaint had been filed at 6:47 that morning. Services began at 10. The complaint alleged excessive noise at 8 a.m., 2 hours before the service began, at a time when no activity was recorded at the building, because Reverend Morehouse had confirmed himself at 6:45 that morning that the building was locked. The complaint was false. The complaint had been filed by an individual whose address was 6 blocks from Greater Zion, and who had filed 3 previous complaints about the church in the past 4 years. All 3 prior complaints had been investigated and closed without finding. The 4th had been routed this morning to Officer Hargrove. She said, "I want you to understand what you have. You have a false complaint that resulted in a uniformed officer entering a church during a lawful religious service. You have the officer making physical contact with you during a lawful religious service. You have 208 witnesses. You have a live stream." He said, "We have a live stream." She said, "The entire exchange is recorded." He said, "How long?" She said, "From the moment he walked in the door. 11 minutes and 40 seconds. He said, "What do you recommend?" She said, "I recommend you call Reverend Patterson at First AME, who has been through something similar and has counsel who specializes in this. I recommend you contact the department's oversight board before you contact the department. And I recommend you let me draft the initial complaint because I know what the complaint needs to say and how it needs to be structured." He said, "You don't have to do that." She said, "Elijah, I watched you stand at that pulpit with a man's hand on your arm and never raise your voice. I watched 208 people stand up without being asked. I watched you finish the sermon. Do not tell me I don't have to draft the complaint." She had retired from the bench 4 years ago after 31 years as a circuit court judge. She had presided over thousands of cases. She had learned to tell the difference between a strong argument and a convincing one in the first 5 minutes of a hearing. She had written opinions that had been cited in subsequent cases and opinions that had been overturned on appeal, and she had maintained through all of it the specific equanimity of a woman who understands that the law is an instrument, and the best use is always the most precise use. She had also spent 31 years watching what happened to people inside the legal system she was part of, and she had developed the particular combination of clarity and determination that comes from understanding a system with complete precision and refusing to let that precision become a reason to stay quiet. She picked up her pen. What she wrote over the next 40 minutes was a document structured with the specific architecture of someone who spent 3 decades in courtrooms and knows how institutional accountability is produced not through passion, not through volume, but through the precise arrangement of documented facts in the sequence that makes them impossible to dismiss. She began with the jurisdictional framework. A church is not a private residence. It is a place of lawful public assembly with specific constitutional protections that predate the current legal code and that have been reaffirmed in federal court on multiple occasions. Entry into an active religious service by law enforcement requires a standard of cause that exceeds a noise complaint of uncertain provenance. She cited the relevant statute. She cited 2 federal cases. She cited the department's own protocol, which she had downloaded and read in its entirety while waiting for him to come home. Then she wrote the timeline. Not her version of the timeline, the documented version reconstructed from sources that did not depend on her or on him. The city's complaint records showing the time the complaint was filed and the time it was dispatched. The church's own security log showing no activity at the building before 9:30 a.m. 2.5 hours after the claimed noise began. The department's dispatch record showing that supervisor approval had not been obtained before an officer was sent to a place of worship during a service. She wrote the officer arrived during an active Sunday service. He proceeded down the center aisle to the pulpit without identifying himself as responding to a specific complaint or providing the basis for his authority to compel the pastor's compliance. He made physical contact with the pastor of the church after the pastor declined to leave his congregation. The physical contact was made during a lawful religious assembly in front of 208 witnesses and was recorded in its entirety by the congregation's own live stream system. Then she wrote what she had not told him yet, that she had already pulled the recording, clipped the relevant 11 minutes and 40 seconds, uploaded it to a secure folder, and sent the link to 2 attorneys before he had arrived home. She had been busy for 2 hours. He said all right. She said all right. He called Reverend Patterson at First AME that evening at Constance's recommendation. Patterson was 64, had been at First AME for 22 years, and had navigated a similar situation 3 years prior. A city inspector who had entered the building during a Wednesday evening service on a complaint that was later found to have been filed in bad faith. Patterson said, "How are you?" Reverend Morehouse said, "I am well. The congregation is well. I want to know what you did." Patterson said, "I called Constance." There was a pause. Reverend Morehouse said, "You called my wife." Patterson said she had just retired from the bench when it happened. I needed someone who understood both the legal dimensions and the pastoral ones. She spent 3 hours with me. She helped me draft the initial statement. What came after that was considerably better because of those 3 hours. He said, "I see," Patterson said. "Elijah, you have something I didn't have. You have a live stream. That is not nothing. That is the thing that makes everything else easier to document. Use it." He said, "Constance is already drafting." Patterson said, "Then you are in the best possible hands." The formal complaint was filed the following morning. It was 14 pages drafted by Constance Morehouse, reviewed by 3 attorneys. The counsel she had recommended a civil rights attorney who had handled 4 similar cases in the state, and a retired federal prosecutor who had taught constitutional law for 12 years after leaving the bench. The complaint cited the false noise report, the unauthorized entry into a place of worship during active services, the physical contact with the pastor, and the documented pattern of prior complaints from the same individual, which the complaint characterized as a coordinated harassment campaign against a black-led religious institution. It cited federal statute. It cited case law. It cited the city's own protocols for responding to noise complaints, which specified that complaints involving houses of worship during scheduled service hours required supervisor approval before dispatch and approval that the records showed had not been obtained for this call. The overnight supervisor on the morning of the incident was placed on administrative review pending investigation. Hargrove was suspended without pay for 30 days pending a full review of his conduct during the incident and a review of his record, which contained 2 prior complaints for conduct during community interactions, both resolved without formal discipline. The city's Human Rights Commission opened a separate inquiry into the pattern of complaints filed against Greater Zion. The individual who had filed all 4 complaints was identified. He was a resident of a property that had been in a long-running dispute with the church over a boundary issue related to the parking area on the north side of the building. A dispute that had begun 6 years ago when the previous pastor had authorized a small expansion of the paved surface and that had never been formally resolved because the boundary in question was ambiguous in the original survey. He was interviewed twice by the commission and once by the department. He retained an attorney before the second interview. His attorney had, in the commission's subsequent characterization, a difficult time explaining why 4 separate complaints filed over 4 years, all alleging noise violations at times when the church's own records documented no activity at the building, constituted anything other than a pattern of harassment. The 4th complaint, the false one that had triggered the morning's events, was referred to the city attorney's office for review of potential liability. The boundary dispute was separately sent to a mediator. It was resolved 3 months later in a settlement that required the complainant to contribute $700 to the church's food pantry fund as a condition of the agreement. Reverend Morehouse had not asked for that condition. The mediator had proposed it, and Constance had accepted it on his behalf before he knew about it. When she told him, he had sat with it for a moment. He had said that's unusual. She had said that's what happens when you have documentation. He had said $700 to the food pantry. She had said yes. He had said that we'll feed approximately 14 families for a month. She had said yes, it will. He had said nothing for a moment. Then he had said, all right. That's all right. Reverend Morehouse was present at none of these proceedings in person. He submitted his statement in writing 14 pages, which matched Constance's complaint at every factual point, and added one element. She had not included a description of what it had felt like to stand at his pulpit in his building in his city and have a man put his hand on his arm on a Sunday morning. He had written it carefully, and he had been specific. He had learned from 31 years of watching his wife work that specificity is where accountability lives. Vague wrongs can be managed. Specific wrongs documented with precision are considerably harder to absorb. The commission's inquiry took 8 weeks. During those 8 weeks, Reverend Morehouse continued his work. He held services every Sunday. He ran the food pantry on its regular schedule. He supervised the after-school program on Tuesdays and Thursdays. He made the pastoral calls he made every week, the hospital visits, the home visits, the calls to the 17 elderly members who needed regular contact to feel connected to the congregation they could no longer always reach. He did not speak about the incident from the pulpit. This was a deliberate choice, and it was not an easy one. Members of the congregation asked him about it. Newer members who had seen the live stream shared widely on social media. It had been viewed over 90,000 times in the first week, asked him how he wanted them to respond to it. Reporters left messages with the church office. An attorney he did not know sent a letter suggesting that the congregation might have grounds for a civil suit and offering to discuss representation. He answered each of these in the way he answered everything, specifically, directly, without drama. To the congregation members, he said, "The correct process is underway. We have made the correct filings with the correct authorities. We will trust that process and participate in it fully and let it do what it is designed to do." To the reporters, the church office said Reverend Morehouse has provided a formal statement through the city's commission process. He has nothing additional to say at this time. To the attorney, he wrote a brief, polite letter declining the representation and explaining that the commission process was the appropriate avenue and that the congregation had chosen to pursue accountability through institutional channels rather than litigation. He said none of this from the pulpit. The pulpit was for the work the pulpit was built for. He had made a distinction early in his ministry between the pastor's public role and the institution's response to institutional matters, and he maintained that distinction with care. The congregation had stood up. They had done what they needed to do. The institutional response was now his and Constance's work conducted through the appropriate channels, and he would not mix the two. It took discipline. He was honest with himself about the fact that it took discipline. There were mornings during those 8 weeks when he sat in his office before the day's work began, and he thought about Hargrove's hand on his arm, and he thought about the 11 seconds, and he thought about his mother standing up in her yellow hat in the front pew where she had sat for 67 years, and he felt something that was not anger. Exactly, he had spent 61 years learning to recognize the difference between the thing that presents itself as anger and the thing that is actually beneath it, which is grief for the distance between what is and what should be, and he sat with it and he named it, and he returned to his work. He did not stop doing the work. The work was the answer. It had always been the answer. Its report ran to 22 pages. The report recommended changes to the city's protocol for processing complaints against religious institutions, including mandatory supervisor review and a cross-reference check against prior complaint history before dispatch. It recommended additional training for officers responding to calls involving places of worship during service hours. It recommended a formal review of the 2 prior complaints against Hargrove. The report was adopted by the commission in a 4-0 vote. Reverend Morehouse read the report on a Tuesday afternoon in his office, which was a small room behind the vestibule with a bookshelf that held 40 years of theology and a desk that held the current business of the congregation and a framed photograph on the wall of his parents, standing in front of Greater Zion in 1971, the year his father became a deacon. He read the report and he set it down and he sat for a moment. He thought about the deacon board meeting on the Monday after the incident. He had told them the account in sequence the way he always told accounts, completely without editorializing with the specific details that allowed another person to understand exactly what had happened. He had told them about Hargrove's entry and the noise complaint and the grip on his arm and the 11 seconds. Deacon Cole had said you never raised your voice. Reverend Morehouse had said there was no reason to. Deacon Cole had said there was every reason to, and you didn't. There had been a pause, and then another deacon, a man named Warren, who was 57 and who had grown up in this church and who had joined the board at 41 and who spoke rarely but with the specific weight of someone who saves his words for when they are needed, had said, "I want to say something about the 11 seconds." The room had waited. Warren had said, "I have been in this building for 50 years. I was in the junior choir when I was 7 years old. I have seen it through the years when it nearly closed and the years when it came back. I have been part of this congregation through deaths and disputes and 2 building renovations and a pandemic. And I have never seen anything like what I saw on Sunday morning." He had said, "I keep coming back to the same thing. We did not discuss it. We did not agree on it. We did not have a leader who told us to stand. We stood because it was the right thing, and everyone in that room knew it at the same moment. 208 people. All of us knew it at the same moment without being told." He had said that is what 67 years builds. That is what 19 years of this man's leadership has built. The ability to know the right thing at the same moment without being told. The room had been quiet. Reverend Morehouse had sat with that for a long time after the meeting ended. He had sat in his car in the parking lot before driving home in the way that he sometimes needed a few minutes between the institutional work and the personal hours to let what had happened settle into its correct place. He had thought this is what a congregation is when it is built well. Not a group of people who follow instructions. A community that has become capable of something together that none of them could have been capable of alone. He had thought, my father knew this. He knew it from his father. This is what has been going on in that building on that corner since before I was born. He had started his car and driven home. One of the younger deacons, a man named Terrence, who had joined the board 2 years ago, had said something that Reverend Morehouse had written down afterward in his journal. Terrence had said, "I want to know what it costs you. Not to get loud, not to react. What does it actually cost you every time you choose to absorb something like that and respond through the correct channels?" There had been a silence. Then Reverend Morehouse had said, "It costs me exactly as much as it costs anyone who has decided that the correct response to wrong is accurate documentation rather than matching volume. It costs me the thing that would have felt satisfying in the moment, but would have made the outcome worse. And I have been making that trade for 61 years. I am not going to stop making it now." Terrence had said, "Yes, sir." He had meant it. Reverend Morehouse could see that he meant it not as deference, but as the specific acknowledgement of a younger man who has heard something he intends to carry. He read the report, and he set it down, and he sat for a moment. He thought about the 208 people. He thought about Sister Loretta Washington standing up on her arthritic knees without being asked in her Sunday dress in the front pew where she had sat for 41 years. He thought about what 11 seconds sounds like when it carries 208 separate decisions made independently and arriving in the same place. He thought about his father in the photograph on the wall standing in front of this building 53 years ago, and the fact that the building was still here, still on the same corner, still doing the same work, still requiring maintenance every 8 years on the steeple. He thought about the live stream. He thought about the fact that the moment had been recorded not by anyone who planned for it to be recorded, but by the congregation's own technology installed 3 years ago during the pandemic, when services had to move online and had simply remained in place because members who were elderly or ill or traveling had found it useful. He thought about the word that Constance had used when she described what the live stream showed evidence. She had used it without irony and without drama the way she used legal terms precisely because precision is where the meaning lives. Evidence. An 11-minute and 40-second recording of a man entering a church during Sunday services, disrupting a lawful religious assembly, making physical contact with the pastor, and then standing in the center aisle in front of 208 people who had risen silently to their feet. He thought about what the recording had shown that he had not been able to see clearly in the moment the faces of the congregation as they stood. He had watched the recording twice with Constance on Sunday evening. He had watched the faces. He had seen Sister Washington's face, not angry, not afraid, but settled in the specific way of a woman who has made a decision and is at peace with it. He had seen Deacon Cole's face behind her. He had seen Denise Harrington, who had joined 6 years ago through a difficult time and had found in this place something she had not known she needed, standing in her pew with the expression of someone who has discovered what she is made of. He thought they came here for one reason, and they gave me another reason entirely. He thought 67 years is a long time to be on a corner. He thought we have been here before anything that has tried to move us. He thought we will be here after. He called Sister Washington that evening. He asked about her knees. She said, "They're fine." He said, "I want you to know that what you did on Sunday mattered." She said, "Reverend, I have been sitting in that building since before you were born. There was no other thing to do." He said, "You have been a member of Greater Zion for 41 years. She said 41 years in March. He said, "Can I ask you something?" She said, "You can always ask me something." He said, "When you stood up, was there a moment of decision or did it simply happen?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Elijah, I have been sitting in that front pew for 41 years. I sat in it when the roof leaked and we had to move the right side of the congregation to the left during a rainstorm. I sat in it through 3 pastors, though I have to say the third one is my preference. I sat in it when we had 19 people in the room and we sang like we had 200. I sat in it when your father was standing beside me and he was the one taking care of things, and I was the one learning how." She paused. She said, "When that man put his hand on your arm, I was not deciding anything. I was standing up. The decision had already been made. It was made 41 years ago when I walked into that building the first time and understood that it was the place I was supposed to be, and the people in it were the people I was supposed to be with. You don't make a decision in that moment. You discover what you already decided." He sat with that. He said, "That's what I was hoping you would say." She said, "Write it in that journal of yours." He said, "I already did." He said, "I know." She said, "You finished the sermon." He said, "We always finish the sermon." She said, "Yes, we do." He said, "Good night." He hung up. He sat for a moment before going to his desk. He thought about what she had said, that the decision had been made 41 years ago, when she first walked in and understood where she was supposed to be. He thought about how many of the 208 had made that same decision at different points in their lives on different Sundays, through different doors, in different circumstances. A person in crisis who had come in on a Wednesday and found the food pantry and come back the next Sunday. A family that had moved to the neighborhood and tried several churches and settled here. A young man whose grandmother had brought him every week since he was old enough to sit still, who had grown into a person who could choose to be here and had chosen it. Each of them carrying a decision made at some earlier point, a decision that had been stored and waiting until the moment required it. 208 stored decisions, revealed in 11 seconds. He thought about the building that held them, all, the stone facade, the corner it occupied, the steeple that needed painting. Every 8 years, the pulpit that Clarence Dupree had built in 1981 with his own hands, because the old one had been damaged and the congregation needed a new one. And he was a carpenter, and it was the obvious thing to do. The obvious thing to do, that was all it had ever been. He thought, we keep doing the obvious thing. He thought that is enough. He thought that has always been enough. He thought about the first Sunday after the incident, which had been 6 days away, when he had sat in his office reading the commission report. He had known that Sunday would be different, would carry the weight of the previous Sunday in ways that could not simply be set aside. He had thought about how to address it. He had thought about whether to address it directly or to let the service speak for itself. He had decided in the end to do what he always did, to prepare the sermon carefully, to stand at the pulpit, and to let the congregation bring what they brought and to meet it with what he had. That Sunday had been the fullest service in 4 years. 219 people, 5 members who had not attended in months. 3 people who had never attended, who came because they had seen the live stream or heard about it from someone who had. He had not mentioned the previous Sunday. He had not needed to. It was in the room with all 219 of them, and everyone knew it was there. And the knowledge of it made what they were doing together feel different. Not more significant, because what they did together was always significant, but more visible to themselves, more consciously chosen. Denise Harrington had brought her sister that Sunday. Her sister had never been to Greater Zion, had not been to any church in many years, and had come partly out of curiosity and partly because Denise had called her the Sunday of the incident and described what had happened. And her sister had said, "I want to see that place." She had sat in the 3rd pew. She had listened to the sermon. At the end of the service, she had found Reverend Morehouse at the door where he stood every Sunday to greet the congregation as they left, and she had said, "I understand why Denise comes here." He had said, "We're glad to have you." She had said, "I might come back." He had said, "The door is open." It has been open for 67 years. It will continue to be open. She had come back. She was there 3 Sundays later. She was there the Sunday after that. He had learned her name, Patricia, and had noted it in his pastoral journal, where he kept track of newcomers because newcomers deserved the same intentional attention as the congregation members who had been coming for 40 years. He had not mentioned the previous Sunday. He had not needed to. It was in the room with all 219 of them. He had stood at the pulpit and looked out at the room, and he had thought, this is what 67 years looks like on a Sunday morning. He had thought, this is what we are. He had begun to preach. The deacon board had voted at their next monthly meeting to install a second camera to improve coverage of the vestibule area. The vote had been unanimous. Terrence had made the motion. Deacon Cole had seconded it. The installation had taken one Saturday afternoon and had cost $412, which the congregation's technology fund had covered. The camera was installed the following Saturday. On the Sunday after that, Reverend Morehouse had walked through the vestibule on his way to the pulpit and had seen it mounted in the corner, its small red light indicating it was active, and he had nodded at it the way he nodded at things that were doing what they were supposed to do. He went to his desk and opened the journal and wrote the date and a single line beneath it. The line said the congregation stood. 11 seconds, 208. He paused. He wrote one more line. The line said, and they came back. He closed the journal. He turned off his office light. He walked through the vestibule past the new camera with its small red light through the front door of the building that had been on this corner for 67 years. Outside the evening was the particular color of September. In that part of the city, the late-season warmth still in it. The first suggestion of what was coming when the warmth left. The steeple was above him as he came down the steps, freshly painted 18 months ago, white against the evening sky. He looked up at it. He thought about the steeple needing paint again in 6.5 years, which was when the 8-year cycle would next require it. He thought, I will be 67.5. He thought, we will take care of it. He walked to his car. He drove home. The building stood on its corner in the September evening, as it had stood for 67 years, as it would stand for however many years, followed these lit from within by the lights left on in the vestibule, its steeple white against the sky, its doors closed and its record intact. The second camera was recording in the vestibule. The food pantry had a new contribution, arriving at the end of the month, $700 from a settlement from a man who had filed 4 complaints and found the record reading all of them. On the first Tuesday of the following month, 41 children came to the after-school program in the fellowship hall and did their homework at folding tables and ate snacks that 3 volunteers had prepared and went home at 5:30 with the uncomplicated confidence of children who know that the building they are in will be there next Tuesday. It had been there for 67 years. It would be there next Tuesday. That was the whole record read to the end. Subscribe our channel. We tell the stories of the people who finish the sermon.